So we left off yesterday talking about material cycles. So just to recap, in ecosystems, we need a source of energy. The sun, typically. Almost always it's the sun. And energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction, from organism to organism to organism, as one thing meets the other. It's not recycled. We need constant input of energy in the ecosystem. Energy is not recycled. However, materials are. The minerals, the nutrients that living things rely on go through cycles. And we talked yesterday a little bit about the water cycle, carbon-oxygen cycle. Probably the most important one for you to know, and the most important one for you to know on your quiz on ecology, is the nitrogen cycle. So there's a little more detail here than there is in the other cycles. So the nitrogen cycle is important, and there is an abundance of nitrogen in the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, N2 in that form. So it's diatomic nitrogen. But it's pretty much unusable to most organisms. We can't absorb that nitrogen by breathing it in to go into making proteins in our body. It's unusable by us. It's unusable by most organisms. There's a few select organisms that can, though, use that atmospheric nitrogen. They're extremely important to the Earth's ecosystems. Okay? And those organisms are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Okay? So nitrogen from the atmosphere is absorbed by these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Some of them live in the soil. Some have a symbiotic relationship with certain plants, especially legumes, like beans and things like that. They have these nodules on their roots that contain these bacteria, and they fix nitrogen. They take atmospheric nitrogen and transform it into ammonium, okay? NH4 or NH3. Okay? And so that's what these nitrogen-fixing bacteria do. Okay? Now, the forms of nitrogen that's most usable to plants are nitrates, NO3. Okay? And so there are bacteria that can take ammonium and change it into nitrites, NO2. Okay, they're nitrifying bacteria. Other nitrifying bacteria can take NO2, convert it into nitrates, which are most usable by plants. Okay? And plants then incorporate that nitrogen into their tissue. What compounds contain nitrogen in living organisms? What's the most, all of these compounds contain nitrogen. It's one of the key elements. And it's how you sometimes, when you're looking at the macromolecules, how you sometimes recognize this. Proteins. Amino acids contain nitrogen, right? In that amino group. Okay? So they have to have nitrogen for amino acids. So proteins are made with nitrogen in them. And so as plants absorb nitrate from the soil, they put it into making proteins. Where do animals get nitrogen then? From eating plants or eating other animals. And that's how they assimilate this nitrogen. Decomposers, bacteria, fungi can take, dead plants, dead animals, and as they decompose them, those nitrogen compounds return back to the soil as ammonia or nitrate, and so you have this cycle. There are also denitrifying bacteria that take nitrates and turn it back into atmospheric nitrogen and release it back. So you do have this cycle. Okay? So the key thing to know about the nitrogen cycle is nitrogen-fixing bacteria can take it from the atmosphere. It's converted into nitrates by bacteria in the soil, and that's what plants use. And animals get nitrogen by eating plants or eating other animals. And that's the nitrogen cycle, sort of quickly. Phosphorus is another cycle, again, important nutrient, especially for plants. Phosphorus is one of the key nutrients plants need in order to grow. And this phosphorus comes from minerals and rocks and so forth. As they weather, that phosphate gets released into the soil. And then plants can absorb that phosphate. Animals, again, eat the plants and so forth. There's phosphates in the oceans. phosphates return back into the soil through the action of decomposers. So again, you just have this general cycle of phosphorus being recycled in the ecosystem. Okay, if you imagine an ecosystem, if you imagine the courtyard, if it were left and nobody took care of it anymore, nobody ever mowed it again, and you came back, there's some medical advances, and you came back when you're 250 years old to Perry Junior High, which would probably look exactly the same inside. But when you look in the courtyard, it would not look exactly the same. What would it look like?
Like a grassland.
Probably not a grassland. Right?
Probably more trees.
More trees. It would be a forest. In our climate, pretty much all ecosystems, if left undisturbed, would reach a stage of a climax community that we would call a beech birch maple forest, a deciduous forest. Okay? You know, you start off like this, it's got grasses, and the reason it stays like that is because it's mowed constantly. If you stop mowing, all of a sudden those grasses grow up larger, smaller little woody plants would start to grow, little shrubs would start to grow. Some fast-growing trees would then come in, things like pines and so forth. Eventually, they would give way to larger, slower-growing trees, birch trees, beech trees, and eventually form a forest. That process by which the plants and animals in an ecosystem changes over time is called succession. Succession is a change in a community over a period of time because species replace each other. Some species are better adapted to be quick growing and they can come in and colonize an area, but then over time they're outcompeted by other species. And so you have this process of species being replaced until you reach sort of a stable, sort of end stage. If you go to any mature forest around here, what you're generally going to find are the same kind of things, the same plant communities. Beech, birch, maple forest in the lower elevations of New York State. The first species, so if you, let's say, had a different situation, say a farmer is finished with their growing season, they plow out under all the plants, and they're just left with soil. And then they leave that, and that spring, they're not going to continue farming, they just leave it. Those first species that start to grow in that bare soil, we call those the pioneer species, the very first organisms. And it's usually small plants, herbaceous plants, not woody plants, fast-growing things, things that spread very quickly. And then over time they change, eventually reaching the climax community. Succession also takes place in ponds, for example. If you ever had a pond on your property or you pond somewhere, you know that over time they fill in. Because as plants in those shallow ponds grow, die, they fall to the bottom, they decompose, and sort of this decomposing plant matter builds up from the bottom. And then more plants grow, plants that can get their roots into that soil, and eventually can completely fill in. People that have a pond on their property often have to have it dredged or dug up and cleaned out every 10 or 15 years to keep the depth at the proper level, because you have it building up, because there's these plants continually grow. So succession happens in that situation as well. Now there's two types of succession, primary or secondary succession. The key thing is that primary succession is going from basically bare rock to an ecosystem. So how does that happen though? How do you have bare rock and that eventually can form an ecosystem? What can grow in bare rock? Is there anything? What is lichen? It's not quite a moss. A moss is like a type of plant. A lichen is separate. A lichen, if you ever see on rocks like scaly little stuff, it looks like, I don't know what it looks like bluish color. It doesn't even look like it's a living thing, but that's what lichen is. And it can actually grow on bare rock. It can absorb nutrients out of the air and so forth. And then what happens as this lichen and then eventually the mosses, what happens is as they die and decompose, they start to build up a very, very thin layer of soil. And then slightly larger plants can take hold. And then as they die, this level layer of soil builds up even thicker. And over time, the soil becomes thicker, and eventually larger and larger organisms can grow. But that's called primary succession, from bare rock to an ecosystem. Secondary succession is when there's some sort of disturbance, a fire, plowing under a field, something like that, that sort of resets the ecosystem and starts succession over again. That would be secondary succession. And as we look around the world, obviously the abiotic conditions in a certain geographic location will dictate what types of ecosystem forms there. The ecosystem you get, at high latitudes, at the North Pole, is obviously different from what you're going to get at the equator, because there's different conditions. The types of ecosystems that form in in areas where there's a lot of moisture are quite different from ecosystems that form where there's a lack of moisture. And so we call these biomes, these big, huge sort of areas of ecosystem. Okay? And the biomes of the Earth are listed down here. These are the major biomes: the tropical forest, savanna, desert. These are just ice sheets, polar ice sheets. Chaparral, we won't talk much about. Grasslands, our area, temperate deciduous forest, coniferous forest, if you just go a little bit north or if you go up higher elevations, and tundra. Okay. And so what you see is, around the equator, so the tropics, you guys know from Earth science, are between what? Where are the tropics on the Earth? Yeah, which is what latitude?
30, 20,
Not 30.
28.
23 and a half, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
23 and a half are the tropics. So the tropical, when you talk about I'm going to the tropics, you're saying I'm going to a latitude that's between the Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn. You're going to this area. Okay? So that's where you find the tropical forest, things like in Central America and in Brazil. And you see these areas here, all the darker green. Okay? As you move out from there, you have savanna, okay, which is sort of grassland with mixed trees. We'll look at some details in a minute. Desert areas, we have at 30 degrees latitude, north and south, is where we have large expanses of desert because of the way the wind currents form. And so those are areas of dryness. So you see around 30 degrees, we have the great deserts of the world. And as you go north, you get into grasslands, you get into a deciduous forest, which loses its leaves. That's where we are. Just above that, you get into the taiga, or coniferous forest, where you have evergreen trees, pines, spruces, and so forth. And you get to the tundra, where you have permanently frozen ground, and so forth. So those are called biomes. And they are dependent on really two main factors: precipitation and temperature. So in an area where you have a low average temperature and low moisture, you get the tundra. If you have a lower temperature, not quite as cold as the tundra, but a little bit warmer and slightly more moisture, you get the taiga, the coniferous forest. As our temperature increases, again, here we are in the temperate forest. Okay? Grasslands are areas where you have about the same temperature, but slightly less moisture to support trees. More moisture, and you get a rainforest. So you continue going to the higher temperatures. High temperature, very low moisture, you have a desert. Slightly more moisture, and you get the savanna, where you do have sporadic trees. Above that, you get more tropical forest. Okay? And then the tropical rainforest, which has the most moisture and the highest temperature. So the biomes depend on both temperature and moisture.
Wouldn't the desert have the highest temperature?
Yeah, these all are at a high temperature. I'm saying this group of biomes are all at the high end of the temperature spectrum. But the difference between having a desert and a tropical rainforest is not temperature. What is it? It's moisture. So in an identical temperature, the moisture will determine which of these biomes is going to be present. Here are some details. I'm not going to go over all of this, but you have that for your reference. And on the SAT too, and you will get some questions about the various biomes, and a lot of it is kind of common sense and probably things you already know. different types of plants and animals are found in each one, the climate is different in each one, and they're found in different areas. So you could read a little bit about that if you want to, but those are the main biomes that you should know about, and I think you probably know about most of them. But probably if you're not familiar maybe with taiga, the coniferous forest, the evergreen forest, that you would find around here, you do find at higher elevations. The Adirondacks, you go and you have all spruce and pine trees and so forth. That's a coniferous forest, that's the taiga. Grasslands you may have to read a little bit about. We have in the Midwest of the United States. All right, and then finishing up here, just biodiversity. So this sort of straddles between ecology and what we're going to talk about next, human impacts on the environment. Biodiversity is how many different types of living things there are in an area. And some ecosystems, like the tropical forest, the tropical rainforest, have huge biodiversity, have just a multitude of different plant and animal species in a small area. Other ecosystems have a much lower biodiversity. Everything the tundra has a smaller number of different plant and animal species that can live there. And biodiversity is important. Which type of ecosystem would you guess is more stable? An ecosystem with a high biodiversity or low? Yeah, higher biodiversity is more different types of living things that could possibly withstand disturbance, withstand disease, withstand things like that. If you have a limited number of organisms, a lower biodiversity, well, there's a chance that a change in climate, a change in temperature, a change in disease could wipe out some of those species, and there's fewer left that can be there. So more biodiversity generally transfers into a more stable ecosystem. One of the issues is that humans are drastically reducing biodiversity and causing the extinction of species, mainly due to habitat loss. As we make habitats inhospitable to organisms, as we transform them, take a tropical rainforest and then use it for agriculture, we're taking a hugely diverse ecosystem and changing it into an ecosystem of a single species, sugar cane or whatever. And so that disrupts the food web, makes disease more likely. And often, if we think about this sort of selfishly, and you looked at this a little bit in your lab, is that when we remove these species, often there are species that have value to humans. Okay? Often plants and animals produce substances which could be useful in medicine and treatment of various diseases. And they have found various, like we said, that cure-all example in your lab is based on Taxol, a cancer-fighting drug that was found in trees in the tropical rainforest. And as we take a species out of an ecosystem, that has a drastic impact on the ecosystem. For example, if you take a mountain lion out of an ecosystem, it means there's fewer predators, which means the more deer you have, the more they graze. They eat more of the plants. The less plants you have, the more soil erosion, and it could lead to the destruction of the soil, and then you have no more plants, and then you have no more deer, and then you have no more anything. So it can lead to a cascade of negative consequences.
So it's like those city five commercials?
Yeah, like don't, yeah. Exactly.
You lose that, you lose that.
All right, any questions about anything in ecology? The last section's about the last notes we were ever do.
There's more?
Yeah.
Wait, is this in part of ecology?
Yes, it is.
What?
Why did you just put it all in one packet?
Because these weren't done when we started the others.
So much stuff for ecology.
Are these, is there a hard copy of this online?
Yep.
So this gonna be,
Yep.
this gonna be this?
Yep.
So you can answer one question to get on there.
Since Antonio isn't here, I'll say it for him. This is a bunch of sheets for us.
Maybe I can't find my notes. Where'd they go? Human impacts. Maybe it's this. Yeah, there we go. Don't worry, they're here.
Trash.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect timing.
Day 4.
All right.
Oh, and so.
So this is, often I would probably lump this in with ecology because it's related, although it's really could be on its own as well. Living environment is its own unit, but so it's about how humans impact the environment. And you probably know generally what type of impact is it? A negative impact. The people I work with in the summer, I have to work on the Regents exam, they call this the man-bad unit because it's all about humans' negative influences on the environment. So humans have huge impacts because we can alter our ecosystem unlike any other species. Lots of species can alter their ecosystem. A beaver, for example. By damming a stream, a beaver really transforms a huge ecosystem from a stream into a pond. That's a big impact. However, nothing can even approach what humans can do to an ecosystem because we have, machines and we have modern technology. We can basically take any ecosystem and transform it completely. Think about Arizona or Las Vegas. We put a city of millions of people in the middle of a desert where there really should be no city. There should be a relatively low number of people that are able to survive in that, but because we can transform an ecosystem, we can transform it into something that is hospitable to humans. That takes a lot of resources. Also, what's that? Yeah. Also, humans have a huge population growth. There are a lot of us. And that's a key factor. Okay? Because each additional person on the earth requires resources, requires food, wants iPhones and cars and stuff like that. And so the more people you have, the more resources they need from the earth. And that leads to the destruction of various types of ecosystems. And the earth really technically can only support a certain number. Like any ecosystem, it has a carrying capacity. There's only a certain amount of resources to support a certain number of people. And if we reach that carrying capacity, has the population of the earth leveled off to its carrying capacity yet? No. If we look at a graph of human population,
Wow.
so that's the human population graph. So obviously, if we go back, 8,000 years, population is very, very small. And stays relatively small, grows gradually, okay, until, you can see a little dip here for the plague. But then, what happens here? Wow.
It's just, it's,
Yeah.
It's up to like 7
it's
billion.
basically just like a
It's
straight
around
line
like
up.
1,000 years.
Right, and so the reasons, you got someone said it, why? Yeah, modern medicine. Things like the invention of maybe 2 things are most responsible for this. Maybe, let's say 3 things. No, 3 things.
Okay.
Name one of them. Don't just say modern medicine, what?
Penicillin.
Antibiotics, huge. Antibiotics are a recent invention, okay? Early 1900s.
Vaccines.
Vaccines, number 2. So antibiotics prevent infections, cure infections that used to kill people, okay? All the time. Simple little infection. You have a cut, it gets infected. Today, you take an antibiotic, you put an antibiotic cream on it, you're fine.
Back then,
But in the past, if it didn't get better on its own, that infection spreads and it could become fatal. Vaccines, again, even newer than antibiotics, is that we now have eradicated diseases that killed or injured millions of people. Polio, gone, basically. Smallpox, gone, basically. Things like measles, right, much lower today. And that's because we have vaccines. And so those diseases used to kill millions and millions of people, they don't any longer. Okay? So vaccines are a huge part. And the other is the discovery of germ theory, that diseases are caused often by pathogens, microscopic bacteria or viruses. And so we know now we have to have sanitary conditions when we do surgery. We know how to prevent the spread of infections from person to person and so forth. So those 3 things, I think, that's why this population has done this. Okay? And like I said, all those people need resources. They want stuff. They need certain things as well. They also want lots of stuff. So those things that we take from the earth, we call them natural resources. And we sort of split them into categories, renewable versus non-renewable. Renewable resources are things that don't get used up, that return even once they are used. Things like the wind, the sun, water, food. These are things that are they replenish themselves over time. Non-renewable resource, things that get used up, that once you take this and use it, it's gone, and it's not coming back. Fossil fuels, probably the biggest example. Oil that we take out of the ground and burn is gone. It's not coming back, ever. Oil, gas, coal, minerals that we mine from the ground, those are non-renewable resources. Lots of these are used to produce electricity for other purposes. There are renewable ways of producing electricity that are becoming more and more common, especially today in the last 5 years or so. Wind power has increased quite a bit. Hydropower has been around for a while. Solar power is becoming important. My daughter is volunteering for a place called Solarize in Massachusetts, and they're working on increasing solar energy use in Massachusetts where she goes to college. You know, you see all the time now while driving around, you'll see on houses photovoltaic panels which are producing electricity using the sun's energy. It's becoming more common, more cost effective, and so on. It's also geothermal energy. It's using energy from the heat contained within the ground. And that's another, it's not as common, but it is another source of renewable energy. Non-renewable sources, mining coal, oil, again, the fossil fuels. These are non-renewable. You use these things and they're gone. And so there's a limited supply, a finite supply of all of those resources, and we may reach a time when we basically used up those resources. So on Wednesday, we'll talk about some of these specific environmental problems and finish these up, and we'll go from there. So your homework is to finish that test. Time yourself, so it won't take you more than an hour.